Okay, we have a lot to cover in this chapter. So we're going to really divide it into two parts, the French Revolution and then Napoleon. So let's get busy and take a little bit of time and talk a little bit about both of these things. The French Revolution is a huge event in Western civilization and in this chapter. The French Revolution, probably more historical books have been written about the French Revolution than anything else. So the French Revolution takes place in 1789 after a series of problems have plagued France, mostly bankruptcies, problems with the absolute monarchy. If you remember, all of continental Europe essentially is an absolute monarchy. And the people of France have really turned on their king, Louis XVI. There are problems, financial problems. Louis tries to reform those problems and fails miserably. Marie Antoinette, his wife, Madame Deficit, as she was known, spent extravagantly. Crops fail. And so essentially, Louis's advisors come to him and say, we've got to do something. And what we need to do is raise taxes. To do that, Louis has to call into session the Estates General. The Estates General hasn't met in 175 years because France has been an absolute monarchy. And so Louis is going to call them into session and ask them to think about raising taxes. Now, the problem is that, and there's Louis, by the way. The problem is that the Estates General is an outdated body. The originally it voted by estates, the social divisions in France. First estate are the clergy, the second estate are the aristocrats or the nobility, and the third estate's everybody else. And what each of these estates did is they elect delegates, they sent them to the meeting, but each of them has one vote. So you voted as a block, you voted as a group. When that was very outdated. Abbe Emmanuel Sieyès had talked about in his What is the Third Estate, as he had talked about the third estate was everything, that the other two were really parasites. He wants, and the third estate, they want to vote by individuals because when the Estates General meets in May of 1789, there are over 600 representatives from the third estate. Now, if you go back and you voted as a block, you would only have one vote. But if you vote by individual, then you have many more. And the third estate has some help in some of these others too. And so they believe they could carry the day. And they would be able to, and these guys want change. Some people, even in the nobility, are influenced by the Enlightenment and they want change. One of the things they want to get rid of is the absolute monarchy. They want a voice in the government. And so they refuse really to do anything until they can vote as individuals. The They get so frustrated that they will leave. They will proclaim themselves to be a national assembly in June of 1789. They're going to meet. They invite others to come and meet with them, and they want to reform the government of France. The king decides to try to lock them out, and when he does, then he will force them into a meeting in a nearby tennis court where they take an oath. And notice what they say, that they will not disband until they have written a constitution for France. So they are really going to begin to change the government. Out in the countryside, peasants begin to rise up against their nobles in what becomes the Great Fear. So you have violence in the countryside, and it won't be long until you have violence in Paris. In July of 1789, a mob storms the royal prison called the Bastille, and this is when essentially the French Revolution really begins. Today, the French celebrate the 14th of July as Bastille Day, and it's really celebrated like our Independence Day. The Bastille is one of the visible symbols that the French Revolution is beginning. The French Revolution really is broken down into three stages. Okay, the first stage is considered to be the moderate stage, but people are beginning to vie for power inside of what they hope is going to be this new constitutional government. In August of 1789, the National Assembly issues the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. It's molded on the English Bill of Rights. It's molded on really the American Constitution in some ways, okay, where they talk about national or natural rights, which is what Locke had talked about as liberty, property, and resistance to oppression. So they are starting to think about how they're going to force this on the king. In October of 1789, women from Paris marched to Versailles, essentially to demand the king help them with food prices, which had skyrocketed because of bad harvests. So in October of 1789, essentially the king is forced out of Versailles and back into Paris, where he could be observed. And essentially now the king is going to have to really acquiesce to the demands of this really speeding up French Revolution. The what they are going to do is they're going to begin to move towards writing a constitution. Everybody wants a voice in it. Groups form, like the Jacobins, under the leadership of Maximilian Robespierre. I'll tell you about him in a little bit. That are trying to influence the coming new government. They, for example, the Jacobins didn't like government involvement in the economy. So what you're moving towards is eventually the writing of the first constitution. So the Jacobins, of course, want to have a role in that, and other groups do as well, including even women. The women like Olympia de Gouges would they would advocate for women having a bigger role in the government, but unfortunately, women do not get the same rights and can't participate in politics because the chauvinistic attitude of the time believed that women were really too weak or too illogical and too emotional to participate in politics, which was really ridiculous. The other thing that begins to happen as we move towards really the beginning of the Constitution, the first Constitution in France, is that the French Revolution, excuse me, will begin to question the power of the Church in France. The revolution turns on the power of the Catholic Church in France, really turns turns the clergy, the civil constitution of the clergy. It turns the French clergy really into government servants in many ways, and the French will seize church properties and auction them off, and essentially what you have is an attack on Catholic Church in France. The This is always seen to be as one of the most revolutionary parts of the early French Revolution. The uh, the other thing is that outside of France there is growing discontent with the French Revolution, and some have even threatened war. The Austria and Prussia, for example, will threaten war. So you'd have the problem with the uh, the relationship between the new revolution and the new government and church, and its relations with the rest the of Europe. To make matters worse, the French king Louis XVI will try to run away and try to get behind the lines to get into Austria or into Prussia, and so he could be free. So in June of 1791, Louis attempted to flee France. He's caught, returned, put on trial essentially for treason, and two things happen. In April of 1792, France pretty much goes to war with Austria and Prussia, and really at about the same time, the you have this move towards a more radical state. The Jacobins and the sans culottes, which are in French literally without pants, is what it means, but they are industrial workers. They will essentially arrest the king, begin to put him on trial, and when they do, they have to change the government. France goes from a constitutional monarchy to the beginning of a really a republic. The So in June of 1791, when Louis attempted to flee, he gets recognized near the border. He's returned, put on trial, and in January of 1793, he is executed. So the king is beheaded in January of 1793. When this happens, the radicals, the Jacobins that I told you about earlier, begin to seize control of the government. They will really install themselves as what becomes known as the Mountain, and they will essentially begin to dictate the new French Republic. Now, remember, there's a war going on, so things are not going very well in that war. Oh, and by the way, Marie Antoinette will also be executed shortly after. The war is not going very well, and so to deal with this, the really what the Jacobins, the radicals, install is what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. They will begin to put themselves into really major committees like the Committee of Public Safety, where they are going to oversee essentially the war effort at home. The Committee of Public Safety will really politicize all facets of life during what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. They will make a new calendar. They will de-Christianize society. They will draft virtually everybody they can to create a massive army comprised of over 750,000 soldiers, which will eventually begin to turn the tide of the war. But at home, they will also begin to execute their enemies, arresting hundreds of thousands of people as enemies of the revolution, putting them on farcical trials, and then executing many of them by the guillotine. And we don't know. Most people say somewhere between 35 and 40,000 people were executed, but sometimes that number goes up to approximately 50,000. The architect of this is the Committee of Public Safety. Among those are Robespierre, who I told you about earlier, the leader of the Jacobins. Robespierre is a huge figure in this. Georges-Jacques Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, who eventually, by the way, is murdered because of his role in really writing and doing the propaganda of the Committee of Public Safety. He'll actually be murdered by a woman named Charlotte Corday, who stabs him in his bath, and she's put on trial and executed. Remember me telling you about the draft? The levee en masse is really essentially a a massive army. They throw everybody they can into the war effort against Austria and Prussia and begin to turn the tide of the war. But Committee of Public Safety gets so out of hand. Oh, and there's the new Republican calendar where they change the names, the date, the month, the which is very radical. When you start changing people's calendar, that really kind of goes really crazy. Robespierre is eventually executed by the Committee of Public Safety, and it falls apart. And for really from 1795 to 1799, the French Revolution is run by essentially the Directory. It is a group of 5 people who and a legislature of about 500 or so, the Council of 500. And it is a slowing down of the revolution. It's actually a pretty corrupt time. But it's also a time where war is still going on. And Napoleon Bonaparte begins to rise to the ranks. He becomes a very influential general. He will win massive victories in booting Austria and others out of northern Italy or out of Italy and moving France in that direction. But the corruption of the Directory in this last phase of the revolution eventually spells doom for the Directory. The people began to look to Napoleon as a possible replacement for the French government. And he will stage a coup and he will rise to power and become the new leader of France. When he overthrows the French Revolution in 1799, this is the end of the French Revolution. All right, so as you read this, make sure you pay attention to these stages of the French Revolution. All right, when we come back, we'll talk about Napoleon.